Boldwood presents Bad Company on Coronation Close, written by Lizzie Lane and read by Penelope Freeman. Prologue. The coal hole was dark. There was no point in crying, no point in pleading with him to let her out. She'd been a few minutes late putting his dinner on the table. No matter whether he was on the day or night shift, he was fastidious about what time he ate his meals, to the minute, if not the second. And when she was late... There was also the pig bin inspection. Every bone had to be cleanly picked of meat. Vegetable peelings must be boiled to get the last bit of goodness out of them before being thrown in the pig bin. The pig bin itself had to be scrubbed after every emptying. Newspapers had to be properly tied up, or she would be. She tried to remember if she'd done everything she should have done that day, but it seemed that she hadn't. Ever since she was a little girl, she'd hated the dark. Percy knew that, knew how to make her suffer. And here they were with a coal hole off the kitchen beneath the stairs that led to the first floor. The dream of a happy married life had been a nightmare, the coal hole revisited in the darkest, deepest time of the night. Chapter 1. May 1942. Margaret Routledge, who lived at No. 5 Coronation Close, was putting on her war paint downstairs in the house she'd once shared with her policeman husband Percy and their 3 children. Percy was gone, and so was Albert, her youngest son. Her angelic little boy Albert had died from diphtheria around the same time as her husband. The pain of losing Albert was still there, like a knife forever twisting in her heart. Her husband was another matter. She was glad he was gone. It was just the 3 of them now, her 17-year-old daughter Judith and 14-year-old son Howard. A smile flickering on her lips, she pulled on the silky stockings given her by some Yank soldier, an exciting man of the type she was attracted to, a type totally the opposite to her late husband. Once they were smoothed into place, she tucked her hair into a sequined snood, humming along to the song she'd heard the night before. Her life was fun, fun, fun all the way. And why not? She didn't care that her behaviour was the talk of Coronation Close. She didn't care that they called her a tart and frequented places where women sold their bodies, mostly because they had nothing else to sell. People would find it difficult to understand why she had changed so much since her husband had died. To her it was quite simple. Some people indulged in drink or drugs. Margaret had decided she would indulge in sin. A powdered face looked back at her from the mirror hanging on the chimney breast. Stretching her lips into a perfect O, she ran a bright red lipstick from top to bottom, end to end, pouted, brought the top lip onto the bottom one to set it. The result was pleasing. There was no trace of the cowed wife that used to be, the wife who had lived in fear of saying the wrong thing, making the wrong move. She smiled at her reflection. "If only you could see me now," she breathed, her eyes sparkling. "I've become everything you didn't want me to be." People had been shocked by the death of a seemingly respectable man, and there had been sympathy for the widow. Not that Margaret had need of sympathy from anyone, and that included the minister and congregation of the church they'd attended. Eyeshadow next, then mascara. Like a vamp from the silver screen. Sensual, alluring. Happy? "You bet," she hissed. Not as some had expected her to be. Not now, and not back when it had first happened. Margaret Routledge recalled very well the expression on the sanctimonious face of the Reverend Maurice Grinder when he'd visited her immediately following the death of her husband. 2 years ago, But the Reverend's pudding face, his oily voice, and his total ignorance of the nature of their marriage still set her teeth on edge.
The pain of losing your husband will cut deep, but regular prayer and church attendance may go some way to soothing the pain of your tragic loss. Everyone at the church has pledged their support.
He could not possibly comprehend what joy she'd felt on determining that she would never again go to church or adhere to any of the rules her husband had laid down. He couldn't know. He couldn't possibly know. When her icy countenance had failed to thaw, he'd suggested she keep a journal where she could record her happy memories. The fool wasn't to know that there were none, not latterly in their marriage anyway. As for the early years immediately before and after the wedding, well, viewed from a distance, she should have recognized the signs that Percy was a man who needed to control other people. A wife was ideal. She had spent years in purgatory, or hell. She grimaced at the thought of another memory from that time when she'd first realized that she was free. A beatific smile had remained fixed on the Reverend's face. He'd thought he knew Percy but didn't know him at all. Neither did he know her. In fact, she'd barely known herself. That was when she'd exploded. Not fiercely like a fire, but coldly like the ice on window panes. "Get out!" Her voice had been sharp, her look even sharper.
Mrs. Routledge."
That condescending voice. Even now, after the passing of time, it unlocked something deep within her, something obstinate and at variance with the life she'd had and the woman Percy had moulded her to be. A good woman, an obedient woman, a woman with no life outside the family home. That was what Percy had ordered her to be. Not to talk back, not to make decisions, always to obey and present a saintly figure wherever she might be. Sin was anything not ordained or approved of by him. Sin was perfume, makeup, looking anything but a dowdy church mouse. That's how she had lived. And now? Remembering the clergyman scurrying from her house, followed by a barrage of expletives, made her laugh out loud. "I'm going to be everything my husband didn't want me to be. I'm going to be a sinner, Reverend Grinder. Do you hear that? I'm going to be a sinner." Before sliding her feet into a pair of high-heeled court shoes, she crossed the bedroom and looked out of the window. Her lips curled in a surly smile. "There they are," she murmured, her eyes raking the women assembled around the garden gate of No. 2 Coronation Close. Ready to pass judgment. It was an ingrained need to retaliate that caused Margaret to push open the window and shout down at them, "Yes, I'm off out again tonight, and I won't be back until late." They looked up, then looked away again, engrossed in a conversation that was likely about her. Smiling to herself, Margaret slammed the window shut. Jenny Crawford lived at No. 2 Coronation Close with her daughters Tilly, who was 19, and Gloria, who had lately celebrated her 17th birthday. Roy, her husband, had been with them when they'd first moved from slums in Bristol's medieval city centre to the council house, where they had the luxury of an indoor bathroom and a cold water tap over the sink. From the very first, she'd struck up a friendship with Thelma Dawson, who lived opposite in the crescent-shaped close at No. 12. Her son, George, and daughters Mary and Alice lived with her, or did at first. Like a lot of other people, and despite their youth, they were now engaged in the war effort. George was at sea with the Navy, Mary had married rather hurriedly and was living up north, Alice was training to be a nurse. Although it was easy to feel lonely, Thelma had the luxury of having a daughter-in-law, Maria, and 3 grandchildren living just around the corner. It had been Jenny's suggestion to forego a cup of tea and go to the pub, citing the undeniable fact that Thelma looked as though she could do with something stronger. "Are you all right?" Thelma twisted her lips as though chewing on something bitter. "I've got to be all right. What choice do I have? What choice does he have, for that matter?" Jenny felt for her. Peter van Luntzen had come into Thelma's life on Sunday afternoon. A pilot officer with the Dutch Air Force stationed at Bristol's Whitchurch Airport. He'd been stationed there a while, but that had changed about 2 months ago. He'd been restationed, called away for extra training, the details of which he kept close to his chest. "I can't help thinking he's going back there, to Holland, that is. But he wouldn't say. Told me not to worry." "Puh!" she exclaimed, tossing her head. "How can I not worry? Tell me that. How can I not?" Jenny had no answer to that. Her dear friend had led a colourful life, if the fact that her children had been fathered by 3 different men could be called that. Not that she shared her secret with just anyone. It was safe with Jenny. As far as the rest of Coronation Close was concerned, she was a widow like Jenny, and there were plenty of those around after the Great War of 1914 to 1918. Having finished their first drinks, Jenny asked if she'd like another. "My shout," offered Thelma. "No, it was my suggestion we come here. There'll no doubt be another time when I'm in need of you treating me, but for now, another port and lemon?" Thelma didn't argue. Jenny picked her way to the bar, the empty glasses held close at shoulder height. A port and lemon was a bit pricey, but Thelma looked as though she could do with it. Not being a big drinker, Jenny had settled for half a shandy. After handing over a pile of coppers and 2 sixpenny bits, she put her purse back into her brown leather shoulder bag. The table they occupied was tucked into a corner behind a screen, a private place where they could discuss their concerns without being overheard. Conversation hummed in the smoky atmosphere, working men and women out to grab a moment of pleasure following long hours of work. Jenny eyed her friend over the rim of her glass. She took in the strained expression, the fear haunting her eyes. Despite being in her 40s, Thelma was still a good-looking woman. A few strands of grey showed in her glossy dark hair, and her curvy figure was much the same as it had always been, the kind called Rubenesque that featured in old paintings. When she'd first known her, Thelma had been involved with the senior rent collector, a chap called Cuthbert Throgmorton. He too must have seen the similarity between Thelma and the models in old pictures, because he'd painted and sculpted her himself. It had always struck Jenny as strange that Bert, as he was more commonly known, hadn't fulfilled his promise to marry her. She suspected the loss of his mother, with whom he lived, might have affected his judgment, and that was why he'd joined up. He'd not been the most exciting of men, but seemed dependable. It turned out they'd been wrong. The last they heard of him, he was serving as a wages clerk in the army. Peter van Luntzen had come along and picked up the shattered pieces Bert had left behind. Though being the trooper she was, it hadn't taken Thelma long to brush herself off and find herself hopelessly in love. "At my age," she exclaimed to Jenny, her face flooded with colour. "Age has got nothing to do with it. Not in my opinion." And now here they were, sitting across from each other in the bar, Thelma rigid with worry. Jenny decided that getting it out in the open might help. To that end, she asked, "What did he say in his letter?" Thelma winced in such a painful manner that Jenny regretted she'd asked. A swallow of the spicily flavoured drink was swigged before Thelma managed to answer. Nothing much more than he said whilst he was here." It wasn't entirely true. She glanced at Jenny. For goodness sake, if she couldn't trust her dearest friend, who could she trust? "I'm frightened. He's being so secretive." Her eyes widened. "I can't help thinking he's heading into danger. That's why he wouldn't be drawn." Thelma began running a finger around her glass. She looked thoughtful. "I wish I could go with him." "Into Holland?" Thelma shrugged. "I know it's daft. I suppose it's my mothering instinct wanting to take care of him, as if I could." Jenny couldn't help looking bemused. "He's not a child, Thelma. I know that. No need to snap. Sorry." She shook her head. "I just can't help myself. I think of him in the morning and in the evening. It's only natural. After all, you two were talking about getting married." Absorbed in her own thoughts, Thelma did not respond. Jenny eyed her sadly. In her mind, she pictured the handsome man who they hadn't seen for some weeks, his hair the colour of wheat, and a roguish, merry look in his blue eyes. No wonder Thelma had fallen for him. Good-looking, affable, a man of depth. If only she could find someone like that. There was Robin, of course. They'd known each other since their youth, but she'd heard nothing of him since he'd joined up. He'd gone away following his second-hand shop going up in flames. The worst part about it was that his son was responsible for the blaze, and he'd had trouble facing up to it. There was an element of shame, in fact, and difficulty in accepting that Simon was the culprit. He was his son, and our children are precious to us, she thought. What would I have done? Would I have run away? The answer never came, but more questions did. Where was he? How did she know whether he was alive or dead? Let's hope it won't be long until he gets back. It was Peter, Thelma's love, who she was referring to, but could also be applied to Robin. Thelma looked thoughtfully at what remained of her drink, as though hoping she could see something in it, her future perhaps, like a fairground fortune-teller. Seeming to come to a decision, she picked the drink up and downed the lot. I needed that. Thanks, Jenny. Jenny smiled. It's my pleasure. She didn't go on to say that Peter was not only a brave man, but he was also clever. For both Peter and Thelma's sakes, she prayed he would come back safely. And your girls, son and all the family, Jenny said brightly, thinking it a good move to change the subject. How are they? Although Thelma's expression didn't alter, a smile twitched at her lips. Our George is on the Mediterranean run on a minesweeper. They're running supplies to Malta, but he says it's not so dangerous an area as it was. Maria misses him, but keeps herself occupied with the youngsters. As for my Mary, well, she's enjoying married life up north, although there is talk that Gerald might be transferred to London. An office job, no less. Clever clogs, that bloke. Our Alice is happy enough. She shook her head, her expression one of disbelief. Who would ever have thought that she'd become a nurse? A warm, cosy look came to her face as her thoughts transferred away from Peter and onto her children. Glad to see her smiling again, Jenny asked if she would like another drink. Might as well make a night of it. Thelma's hand quickly covered that of Jenny's, who'd been about to rise from the table. No, let me. She had a strong hand, which matched her strong character. Seeing as she only had 2 shillings left in her purse, Jenny conceded that it was her turn. Jenny followed her progress to the bar, a saucy smile lifting her dour expression. How long it might last was anyone's guess, but if there was one thing Thelma was good at, it was socializing. There were risque comments and laughter, both from her and the men she barged through on her way to the bar and back. Thelma had always had a way with men. They laughed with her rather than at her, and rarely got the better of her sharp wit. She was a force of nature, thought Jenny, and of womanhood. "I've got you the same as me," she said when she came back carrying 2 measures of port and lemon. Laughingly, Jenny remarked that Thelma might need to carry her home. "You should know by now that I can't hold my drink. It's only 1. Half a shandy doesn't count. Now, tell me about your girls. Heard much from Tilly?" Pride shone on Jenny's face at mention of her eldest daughter. "She's loving being in the land army." Her smile vanished as a worrying thought came to mind. "I sometimes wonder if she'll ever come back to Coronation Close." "Of course she will. You're here." Jenny didn't voice what she was thinking. Thelma loved her family around, especially her son and Italian daughter-in-law. It was hard, but Jenny had prepared herself for the time when her girls would fly the nest. The war had been brutal, but had also opened wider horizons for women. Would the younger generation go back to the old way of life? Marry, have children and keep house? They might do, but in a different country. Many young women had taken up with the handsome young men who looked smart and had money. Women had been liberated from the old life. Men were about to be shocked at the changes that had occurred. "And your Gloria's growing up." Jenny held back a threatening grimace. "Gloria will always be Gloria." The fact was that Gloria was the wild one, although carefree and willful might be a better description. "They all go through a phase. Look at my Mary, in love with a Canadian one minute, who by the sound of it was of Indian descent, the next minute marrying a steady Eddie and settling down like a turtle dove to married life. I never would have thought it." "You miss her?" Thelma nodded, her eyes downcast. Jenny bit her lip. She hated seeing Thelma looking down. It just wasn't her. But what with worrying about Peter, she could understand it and sympathised. They were both lost in their own thoughts when someone began playing the piano and singing in a voice that grated on the nerves. Thelma broke out from her thoughts and frowned in the culprit's direction. "That bloke's got sausages for fingers and the voice of a block drain. Time we went, I think." Jenny agreed with her. "Look at the time. Gone 9 o'clock. The stick-thin legs of the wooden chairs grated across the floorboards, dark with spilled beer accumulated over many years. As their slightly pink faces hit the evening air, Thelma laughed. "It's not that late. It's not midnight when you're likely to lose your glass slipper and be chased by a handsome prince." The fresh air smelled of late wallflowers, most welcome after the fog that pervaded the public bar. They would have been more comfortable in the saloon bar where most women congregated, but Jenny had judged that Thelma needed a bit of noise to help drown the turmoil she felt inside. Absorbed with her own problems, she failed to notice the faint glimmer of concern in Jenny's eyes. A trio of aeroplanes flew overhead just as they turned into Coronation Close. Thelma followed their progress with a worried frown. "They're ours," Jenny said reassuringly, "on their way to the airfield." Thelma heaved a huge sigh. "I wish I could believe that Peter's on one of them, but I've a worrying feeling that he isn't even in this country. It scares me to think about it." "Where do you think he is?" Thelma dropped her gaze from overhead, her expression tense. "I know he went for parachute training. You don't do that unless you're going to be dropped somewhere. And it certainly won't be Victoria Park," she said with an attempt at humour. Chapter 2. The summer twilight of late evening was awash with swarms of insects beneath the trees on the green that divided the crescent of houses in Coronation Close. Children not yet called into bed ran through the midges beneath the trees, uncaring that they might have swallowed a few in the process. The call went out from parents, mothers mostly, for them to come into bed. "Get in here, I'll give you a clipper in the ear." A reluctant tide, they drifted to their front gates, heads bowed and hands over their ears, just in case the threat was carried out. Thelma had been about to ask Jenny if she'd heard from Robin. What did Tilly have to say, and when was she coming home? On seeing her front gate hanging open, she stopped, rested her clenched fists on her hips, and tutted in annoyance. "I'm sure I didn't leave that gate open. Them kids will get a clip round their ears from me if they're to blame." Jenny suggested that the kids might not be to blame. The gate open might be due to a stray dog. Despite a lot of dogs being destroyed prior to the beginning of the war, the odd stray did wander into the street and houses, scavenging for scraps. "They might have done." She slammed it shut behind her. "Never mind. It's shut now." "Good night, then." "Good night." Like all the residents of Coronation Close, Thelma's habit was to access a house via the side path and then through the back door into the kitchen. The latter was usually left unlocked. All it required to open it was a firm push, though not tonight. At 9:30, the path that ran between the side wall of the house and a tall hedge was already pitch black. Because of that, she got out her front door key. Jenny left her to it, heading for home, a cup of cocoa, a book, and an early night. Strong drink made her feel a bit woozy. Aware that Thelma had already put her key in the lock and pushed the door open, she was about to do the same. Unlike Thelma, she had not left her back door open. When she heard Thelma shout for her to come quickly, she turned and looked across the road. The front door was still open, an oblong of light falling out onto the front garden. There was no sign of Thelma. Taking her key from the lock, Jenny retraced her steps to the front gate and crossed over to number 12. On reaching the doorstep, she called out, "Thelma? Is anything wrong?" Her first thought was that she might have had an accident. The patch of light from the front door became larger as Thelma appeared and opened the door wider. Even in the encroaching darkness, Jenny perceived the shocked look on her friend's face, the dropped jaw, the wide open eyes. A swift intake of breath was accompanied with, "Someone's been in here." The firm voice Jenny knew so well sounded sharp with shock. "What? Are you sure?" Brusque, chin set square, Thelma stepped to one side of the doorway. "Take a look for yourself." Thelma was house-proud. Nothing was ever out of place. Pride of place was her collection of Coronation crockery displayed on the built-in dresser at one end of the living room. "Just look. Just look." Jenny covered her lower face with both hands. Even then her gasp was audible through her spread fingers. It seemed that every single cup and saucer, mug, bowl, jug or plate had been thrown onto the floor. Most were in pieces, handles without cups, plates broken into jagged shapes that no amount of glue could ever put back together. Thelma, too, looked shattered, shocked to the core. Jenny found her voice. "Who would do such a thing?" Thelma picked up a few of the broken pieces, then let them drop again. Never in a million years could any of it be put back together. Her eyes were dark anyway, but now they turned darker. "Kids?" Jenny thought of the children running around on the green, all gone into bed now. Was it possible that they were the culprits? After thinking about it, Jenny suggested it might be one of the gangs that robbed, bombed deserted houses. There were a few of them around. They'd even given themselves names like the Scallywags or the Marauders. Most of them were school-age, though not all. "If I get my hands on them." Although Thelma clenched her fists as though ready to land a few punches, it sounded to Jenny as though she was on the verge of tears. Thelma was tough, thanks in most part to the life she'd led. Brought up in a children's home, 3 children by 3 different fathers, her collection of coronation memorabilia and her fondness for the royal family was somewhere she retreated to that helped her rise above what her life was and had been. Words were sought that Jenny couldn't utter. These broken bits of crockery represented so much in Thelma's life. Who could have been so cruel? Surely either of the local gangs of lads, little more than children, couldn't do such an awful thing. Thinking along those lines brought Simon, Robin's son, to mind. He'd been so hating of his father's relationship with her that he'd set fire to his business premises. All that Robin had worked for had been lost. Jenny lowered herself as close to the floor as she dared, the jagged pieces likely to tear her stockings. Stockings were expensive and rare. Jaw set firm, Thelma remained standing, her tall shadow falling over her. Jenny picked up a large shard of broken plate depicting Queen Mary, one half of the coronation of King George V and his queen. At least it was a half, she thought. The king's half of the plate was smashed into at least 6 pieces. Keeping her eyes on Thelma, Jenny rose slowly to her feet. Was that despair she saw on Thelma's face, or resignation that there was no chance of gluing any of the splinters and jagged remnants back together? So what else could be done? "Do you want me to fetch the constable?" The police constable who had replaced Percy Routledge was a dependable sort. He'd been pensioned off at the outbreak of war, then called back in once half the local police force had been called up to serve their country. Thelma appeared not to have heard. For a moment it seemed as though Jenny could have poked her friend hard enough for her to fall over. She was that stiff, that unseeing. She tried again. "Thelma? Would you like me to go to the telephone box and phone the police?" Thelma narrowed her eyes and pursed her lips, a sure sign that she was thinking very deeply indeed. "I would be grateful if you could help me clear up the mess." Thelma's response had surprised Jenny. Just that? Thelma eyed her sidelong. "At this moment in time, I've got more serious things to worry about than a load of broken china." "Yes, I suppose you do." Jenny headed for the kitchen and the back of the coal house door where the dustpan and brush hung from a nail. The coal house was off the kitchen, a narrow, dark place beneath the stairs. The stairs ran up from the hall at the front of the house. It had always struck Jenny that keeping the coal in a cupboard off the kitchen was not an ideal situation. Still, Bristol Corporation must have had a good reason for doing so. "Won't be a moment." With that, Thelma was gone. Jenny heard her voice blaring out at the kids on the green from the front door. "Was there any of you lot? Come on, tell me, or I'll beat you with that cricket bat you've got there." The small figures were no more than black smudges against the indistinct background of grass and trees.
"We didn't do it. Nothing to do with us."
"Any other kids from around? Did you see any of them go into my house?"
"No, missus. Honest, missus. No other kids have been around."
"Anyone else?"
"Air raid warden might have been."
"You saw the air raid warden? Did he go into my house?" The kid who'd suggested it shrugged.
"Don't know. It was my turn to bowl."
"How'd you know it was an air raid warden?"
"He was wearing a tin hat, of course."
The boy said it as though she really should have known better. Air raid wardens wore tin hats. So did a few other people. Back in Thelma's living room, Jenny was sweeping bits of broken china into the dustpan, and from there into the dustbin. Thelma followed her out through the kitchen to the backyard. "I'm going to call in at the air raid post. God help 'em if one of them's responsible." Jenny shook her head. "But why would they be?" "Could have been an accident. Thought they heard an intruder or something." Holding the dustbin lid in one hand, dustpan in the other, Jenny looked solemnly down into the bin, which was barely distinguishable in the diminished light. Thelma's face was solemn. "That broken crockery represents the best part of my life. Now look at it. Just rubbish in the bottom of the bin. It's just stuff. Not you, Thelma. Your life isn't over yet. And there's something much more exciting on the horizon. You and Peter are getting married. You know he wants to. I'm already thinking about my outfit. A pair of brocade curtains should make a decent jacket and skirt, don't you think? I'll expect you to help me cut it out and sew it up." Thelma looked at her incredulously, her dark, perfectly formed eyebrows arched and hinting at humour. Thelma gave the bin a kick, which resulted in the broken china rattling like a bucket of chains. "You're right. It's the past in that bin." They went back into the kitchen. Thelma held her head to one side as she automatically filled the kettle and lit the gas. "I'm going to stick my neck out and make a promise. No more gathering of Coronation crockery until I know that Peter is safe and well." Jenny recalled seeing Thelma's collection for the first time back in 1936, the year of 3 kings. First King George V, who had died, to be replaced by his eldest son, King Edward VIII, the king who was never crowned. Edward had abdicated so he could marry the twice-divorced American Wallis Simpson. He'd been replaced by his brother King George VI. All in all, it had been quite a year. The most important thing in Jenny's life had been moving into Coronation Close and meeting Thelma. She'd never regretted it. "Do you mean that?" Thelma threw back her head and laughed. "You bet I do." It gladdened Jenny's heart to see Thelma laugh. Thankful that Thelma was holding up, Jenny did as she intended that night. A cup of cocoa, some music on the wireless, then a book that she'd begun to read. Although really, she sat in the armchair staring off into the distance, not really seeing anything at all. Why hadn't she mentioned to Thelma that she had something of her own to worry about? There was no answer, except it seemed that by voicing it, the problem would take on a life of its own. It would be accepted, and therefore real. Leaving the cocoa half finished, the book flung to one side, she headed for bed. For a moment she stood at the bedroom door, staring at the double bed where she'd once slept with her husband Roy, a long time ago, before he'd joined the army, a career soldier who loved being with other men, a sick man when he'd come home, never to recover or go back to the life he'd loved so well. She'd been alone ever since, except for Robin. She'd worked for him at his second-hand furniture business and had hoped that they might end up together. What she'd hoped for, and reality, had not been on the same track. Flinging off her slippers, Jenny walked barefoot across the bedroom and began to undress. Before removing her underwear, she slid her cotton nightgown over her head. So attired, she picked up her hairbrush and kept brushing until her hair began to crackle. Her hair gleamed, and although she was in her 40s, there were few grey hairs. She supposed that this was down to the fact that grey, or white, blended easily with fair hair. Her deep-set eyes scrutinized the reflection looking back at her from the dressing-table mirror. She was oddly surprised to find that she looked as she always looked. Nothing had altered, or so it seemed. Was it still there? Wishing against hope, she ran her hand down onto the soft firmness of a breast that had fed children, acted as their cushion, lured her husband's eyes. Her fingers delved down between her breasts, divining further over and beneath the curve of her left breast. All felt silky smooth, soft as a feather cushion, as it always had. Except at the very bottom of the curve. Her fingers found the hard lump that she was trying to pretend did not exist. It could have been that I hit it when I was taking the bin out, bruised it. That's what she told herself as she climbed into bed. Imagining a future with her daughters married and presenting her with grandchildren was a pleasant diversion and helped her sleep. So, too, did telling herself that it would be gone by the morning. It wouldn't be the first time she'd told herself that. The lump remained. The best way to fall asleep was to fix visions of Tilly and Gloria in her mind. Thinking of them made her smile. Jenny closed her eyes. Chapter 3. Merryweather Farm, Suffolk. Tilly Crawford, Jenny Crawford's daughter, was dreaming that she was on a tropical island just like the one described in Desert Island Discs on the wireless. The blue sky joined seamlessly with the sea, which continually tossed surf-crested waves onto a sandy beach that blazed white beneath the incredibly white sunshine. It was somewhat disappointing to open her eyes and see only a thin strip of pale grey daylight. The faded green curtains that might once have been deep green didn't meet in the middle, thanks to age and shrinkage after being boiled in the wash. She groaned and buried her face into the pillow. Mrs. Forrester, the farmer's wife, never failed to shout up the stairs half an hour or so after the farmyard rooster had crowed.
"And cock-a-doodle to you too,"
Tilly muttered, her voice muffled by the pillow. Mrs. Forrester's foghorn voice shouted again. "Miss Crawford, if you want your breakfast, you better shake a leg and get down here." Not keen to shake a leg or anything else for that matter, Tilly blinked, groaned, and buried her nose further into the pillow in the hope of obliterating the smell of fried bread. Always and forever she would refuse bread deep-fried in beef fat. Mrs. Forrester was not one to give up easily. "Did you hear me, young lady?" A thud from a heavy boot vibrated the first tread of the bare-wooded stairs. Mrs. Forrester meant business. There was nothing genteel or ladylike about the farmer's wife. She wore heavy boots most of the time, indoors as well as out. Summer it might be, but dawn had only just broken. That's how it was on Merryweather Farm. The moment it was light, everyone was turfed out of bed, fed a breakfast of fatty bacon, an egg, 2 if the hens had been generous, and the ubiquitous fried bread cut thick enough to be termed a doorstep. There being a long day's work ahead, there was no way she could possibly go without breakfast. Despite the hard work and the fatty breakfast, Tilly did not regret joining the land army. She even loved the uniform, and the fresh air, even the earthy smell of damp fields, and always animals. Flinging the bedclothes aside, she swung her legs out of bed and reached for her green jumper, white shirt, brown hat and jodhpurs, plus the thick socks. The latter looked quite incongruous when at this moment worn with her zip-up slippers. She'd left her muddy boots downstairs, knowing very well that Mrs. Forrester would have scraped the mud off and readied them for her to wear for another day. Boots were acceptable downstairs, but not upstairs. Unless you were Mr. and Mrs. Forrester. On arrival in the warm farmhouse kitchen, Christine, her fellow land girl, was already at the table, her face greasy with fat from the piece of fried bread she was halfway through eating. Christine had the sort of face that reminded Tilly of cream and red apples. Creamy complexion and apple-red cheeks. Her eyes were blue and her hair the colour of straw, and when she opened her mouth, you knew beyond doubt that she was from London. Thinking of cream brought the apple pie and cream Tilly had consumed the night before to mind. Mrs. Forrester had skimmed the cream from the top of that day's milking. The pie had been made 3 days ago, big enough for everyone to have large portions for each day. Tilly had to admit that food in the country was superior to that in the city. Ration books were used for tinned things, soap, washing flakes and such like, things that the farm could not produce.
"Get that breakfast down, you Tilly," exclaimed a grinning Christine. "Don't want to faint away in the field from lack of nourishment, now do ya?"
A merry chortling accompanied by a saucy wink left Tilly in no doubt that the jovial London girl was taking the mick out of Mrs. Forrester, who said the same thing every morning and tended to repeat the same sentence more than once. "Get that breakfast down, you Tilly, my girl, or you'll be fainting away in the field." Tilly exchanged a cheeky grin with Christine and said, "Yes, Mrs. Forrester." Back turned to them, Mrs. Forrester had put on her horn-rimmed glasses, her hand searching behind one of the ugly ornamental urns at either side of the mantelpiece. "I got a letter for you, Tilly. It got delivered to the post office yesterday. Mr. Bedloe gave it to our Johnny in the pub last night. It was too late to hand it to you. I expect it's from your mother." Tilly's eyes lit up as she took it. Although she loved the farm and the Forresters had made her very welcome, there were times when she missed her mother and Coronation Close. Sometimes she even missed her sister Gloria. They were chalk and cheese, but blood was perhaps thicker than water. Tilly was the self-possessed and thoughtful one. Gloria tended to be full of herself. It could be downright annoying. "Eat your breakfast before opening it." Tilly slid the envelope into her pocket and attacked the plate placed in front of her. She would prefer to be alone when she read the letter, just in case she was tearful, which might be likely. 2 cups of tea later, she was ready for the fresh air and hard work of the farming day. "Going to read it now, then?" Tilly was already on her feet. "Must get on. I read it later when I eat my lunch. Is it cheese and chutney sandwiches?" She refrained from adding the word again. It was Mrs. Forrester's habit to provide them with cheese sandwiches made with her own bread, own churned butter, and homemade cheese. Sometimes it came with chutney lathered on so thickly that it oozed onto her fingers. Licking off the excess was a delicious experience. A filling of cheese coupled with tomatoes or salad was not so messy, but just as delicious. The main variation from cheese sandwiches was thickly sliced ham, but then only after a pig had been slaughtered, salted, and hung from the rafters in the old smokehouse. A slice of pork pie was set aside as an evening meal, and often followed by stewed fruit picked straight from the orchard. She knew she'd guessed wrong and it wasn't cheese today, when Mrs. Forrester waggled her head from side to side, as one of the horses did when Tilly had given him a carrot. A sign of pleasure for the giver and the receiver. "Now I slice some ham," she exclaimed, her meaty fists resting on her equally meaty hips. "There's still plenty left. Though as it's been hanging there a time, we might have to eat it more quickly. Might even have to sell some if the weather gets warmer. Look at the old dairy's cool. Them walls are 2 feet thick. Thanks be to Mr. Forrester's great-great-grandfather." Her eyes looked up at the ceiling as she reconsidered what she'd just said. "Or was it his great-grandfather?" She laughed. "No matter. Whoever it was had his head screwed on. I'd never known anything go off in there." Ham sandwiches, the leg of ham home-cured, hung up in the smokehouse for a few months until it was succulent and very, very tasty. Even though she'd just had breakfast, Tilly's mouth watered at the thought. Mrs. Forrester followed them out to the door. "Tell your mother that you're being well fed here. Wouldn't want her to think you're missing home too much. Don't go telling her that. It would only worry you. Eat your sandwiches all up. Don't want you fainting off in the field. In other words, she was aching to know the contents of the letter once Tilly had read it. The two girls reined in their laughter. Mrs. Forrester was a good sort, and Tilly for sure didn't want her to think they were making fun. They were still laughing when they were outside, their Wellingtons splashing through the sloppy mud. Milking the cows was their first job of the day. The grey of dawn was giving place to early morning. The milking sheds were lit by just 3 electric light bulbs, which did not quite reach the further corners. The farmhouse was still gaslit, the meagre glow boosted by strategically placed oil lamps. A candle carried by each of them lit their way, up the stairs to the attic. 2 single beds, a chest of drawers, wash basin and jug. Nails were positioned along one wall to take their clothes. Payment for their accommodation was 16 shillings per week, half of the 32 shillings wages. Yes. If she'd stayed in Bristol, Tilly could have been paid more, and she would have had all the advantages of shops, friends, family, and access to everything a city could offer. At first, she'd wondered if she would ever get used to doing without all she'd been accustomed to, but the countryside gradually grew on her. "What will you do when the war's over?" asked Christine. Tilly, whose shoulder was thrust into a cow's side, face warmed by its flank as she pulled the teats, thought before she answered. "I haven't given it much thought. I suppose it depends what's on offer." The last squeeze and the bucket was full to within 5 inches of the brim. More than that, and it would be slopping out. "How about you?" Christine laughed. "Let's put it this way. There's more going on back in London than here, if you know what I mean," she added with a grin. "You'll miss the dances at the airbase." Christine loved the young Americans from the airbase. "They got more going for 'em than the local lads." "Such as stockings and chocolate?" Tilly questioned. "There's that." Christine tilted her head and drew on a cigarette. "But I won't be staying around here. Once the war's over, the only dances will be at the village hall and not a Yank in sight." She pulled a face. "All farm labourers with rough hands and smelling of oil or manure. Yuck." She shook her head vehemently. "No bloody thank you." After they'd chivied the cows out into the fields, their next task would be to wash the floor of the milking parlour. After that, John, Mrs. Forrester's oldest son, would start up the tractor and take them out into the fields. This was the bit Tilly liked most, being out in the fresh air and looking west from the farm in the general area of the city of Bristol and imagining what was going on there. Her mother's letter would tell her more of the comings and goings in Coronation Close. There hadn't been an air raid for a long while now, and she lived in hope that there wouldn't be. If there had been, she'd feel a bit guilty not being there. London was the only place being attacked from the air, the menacing V-1 rockets, termed doodlebugs by the populace and the press. A cool breeze caressed her cheeks as she scrutinised the barns, milking shed, and lean-tos built of rough stone a few centuries ago. The slurpy mud mixed with the cow droppings, the duck and chickens puddling around the edge where grass heads drooped heavy with seeds. The stone buildings had a mellow, warm look when the sun was shining, like today. Sad-looking and oddly haunting when grey Suffolk skies hung like a blanket over the flat, fertile acres. "I like it here." The thought came as something of a surprise and made Tilly ask, "What will you do when the war ends?" Christine stopped tumbling potatoes into sacks.